Well, the first thing I think he would do would be to stand up and tell the truth. I mean, he had a great expression that was just tell the truth and watch them scatter.
So the further away the problem is, the easier it is to postpone action on it. And that's essentially what we're doing.
Be real. Because people in New Hampshire are really cool.
I'd say get in the game. This is a problem facing your generation. You have to have a voice in the decision. Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we'll begin by looking at the future of interest rates as the Federal Reserve Board assesses whether enough progress has been made in lowering inflation so that they can start reducing interest rates. Our guest for that discussion is Gordon Gray, Executive Director of the newly created Pinpoint Policy Institute. And then we'll have a very special exit interview with Tori Gorman, the Concord Coalition's longtime policy director, as she begins a new job this week with the congressional research. So good for the CRS, bad for the Concord Coalition. And we wish Tori well, and we'll be talking to her later in the show. Concord Coalition Chief Economist Steve Robinson joins me for the entire program. So, Gordon and Steve, welcome back to Facing the Future.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, Bob.
Let's see now. Gordon, you just took part in this new venture, Pinpoint Policy Institute. So
right.
Before we get into the numbers, could you give us a little background about that?
Happy to, and I appreciate the opportunity. So the way I view it, the United States has a great story to tell. We are the world's largest economy, and we also deliver the highest standard of living to our citizens compared to other major economies. And I think that the building blocks, the pillars of that prosperity are worth promoting and defending. I think when I look at the policy landscape, frankly, the way I've characterized it is I've got clowns to the left of me and jokers to the right. And I view the policy landscape as one where basic economics are being challenged. And this manifests in sort of the rediscovery of bad, failed policies. And so we've seen recent examples of this from the left and the right. We've seen a resurgence in tariff and protectionist policies. These are becoming increasingly popular the world over, and it's unfortunate to see these policies being rediscovered and re-embraced because the economics on these are clear. Trade barriers make Americans worse off. It's that simple. We are also seeing, and a lot of this is coming from a populist strain. And since we're also in an election year, we're seeing sort of competing populism and a bidding war in who can out-populist each other. So just recently, the President of the United States has announced something like national rent control, yet another terrible idea that has been a demonstrable failure every time it's been tried. And so part of Pinpoint's job is to simply protect and defend the basic elements of American prosperity. And if I could reduce it even further, is let's just not mess this up. Do no harm as a sort of first condition for economic policy. And that can be a tough sell, frankly, in a populist environment.
Turn now to the economy and also bring in Steve, but just as sort of background, the question everybody's waiting to hear now is when is the Fed going to finally begin reducing rates after having raised them to fight inflation and held them where they are now for quite some time. So there've been some good news recently on the inflation front. It's kind of marginal good news. And it's not like, huge reductions in inflation, but it has in the last three reports been inching downward anyway, but still stuck. Well, maybe not stuck, but it's still at a level that's relatively high relative to where the Fed would like it to be. We still have decent job growth. The economy is growing, although it's slower than it was last year. The unemployment rate is ticking up a little bit, but not dramatically. It's perhaps even like a healthy increase in the unemployment rate. So, Gordon, if you're on the Fed,
Mm-hmm.
how are you processing all this and thinking about a potential rate cut?
First of all, I think the way I talk about inflation is we tend to view this, I think, through three separate lenses. So first is, what is the rate of price growth just in absolute terms? And on that front, we remain unsatisfied as observers. Year over year, we're still at something like 3%. Second way to look at it is, what is the trend? What has been the movement relative to past prints? And there we've seen marked progress. The yearly rate is tending to come down. Saw essentially flat negative prints in the last, or negative readings in the top line and core in the last print, followed on the heels of a relatively good print before. So the trend in the near term is pretty good. One note of caution is we've sort of seen, particularly in the summer, we've seen some of these movements before, so false dawns on tempering of inflation. And so I'd note that for when we sort of talk about how the Fed's got to look at this. And then the third lens through which we look at these, I think, as observers, is sort of relative to expectation. So you take the trajectory, the trend, and other inputs in mind, and you formulate an outlook. And then if you can get upside or downside surprises, and then I think that can tend to really move minds. And some of the good news we've seen, some of it was expected. Most recent print, some of that good news was even better than we thought in terms of the taming of inflation. So that might pull your outlook a little closer in terms of when you're expecting some moderation in monetary policy. But also, along the lines, as along the same lines as you observed, we've seen some upticks in unemployment. We've seen some, not necessarily signs of weakness per se, but weakening in the labor market. So the pace of hiring just on a monthly basis has plainly decelerated. I think the last month's jobs report was about 200,000 net payroll growth. About 70,000 of that was in government. Those can be aberrational. It's not necessarily the best look at the sort of pace of hiring in the private sector. We've seen steady increases in unemployment, 10 basis points, essentially for 3 months on the trot. We'd worry about that if that continued unabated. That gets us into that SOM rule territory, which we can revisit. Essentially, a potential sort of leading indicator of a downturn if the unemployment rate really exceeds the recent past averages. So all these come together to an equilibrium that I think the Federal Reserve Chairman, in his recent testimony for the Financial Services and Banking Committee, he characterized these risks increasingly in balance, or employment and inflationary measures as imbalance. One trouble there, though, or one element of trouble, is that the last mile of inflation is the most difficult. There was some really great research by the doctors Romer, David and Christine on basically the track record of the Federal Reserve to stamp out inflation. And essentially what he found is that there's real risk in not being committed. And essentially they coded and characterized this central bank's responses to inflationary periods. And basically they failed and allowed inflation to persist in those instances where they weren't really willing to risk the unemployment component of their dual mandate. And I think we should be mindful of that. Just the historical record and the record of the literature, but also some of the comments from Chairman Powell. I think he really marked a signal change in the Fed's direction, way back in 2022, I believe it was Jackson Hole, where he was saying, we are going to control this. and we will march inexorably towards that goal. And so when I read Goldman Sachs sort of putting out reports, I think this week on why wait, somewhat making the case for a July rate cut. Well, that's why you don't, that's why you wait, is because there's real risks that you're going to fail to control inflation. And then with other elements in the macro economy, you could see ourselves in an inflationary environment while facing a downturn. And you want to tame inflation first.
Okay, well, we'll get to that on the other side of the break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Chief Economist Steve Robinson and I are talking with Gordon Gray, Executive Director of the Pinpoint Policy Institute. We'll be right back after these short messages.